All right, so for the last part of chapter 19, we're going to talk about some consequences of global warming. One of the first consequences is the melting of the polar ice caps. And make sure if you ever were to do a free response about this that you would include polar ice caps, not just say ice caps. Um, because yeah, there's different ice caps over the world, but we're talking about the polar ice caps, which are 39% smaller than they were in 1979. The continental glaciers, which are different than the polar ice caps. The polar ice cap is the sheet of ice at the North Pole. Um, Glaciers are sheets of ice within continents that are on top of land masses. And so glaciers are declining as well. There's Glacier National Park out in Washington, and in 1850 there were 25 glaciers on the continental landmass in Glacier National Park, and there's only 25 today, and there's predicted to be zero by the year 2030. Uh, as far as glaciers go, these are very important in terms of the formation, the addition to the glaciers in terms of ice in the wintertime, and then the subsequent melting of the glaciers in the spring and summertime provide most of the fresh water sources for rivers in which lie adjacent to these glaciers. So as these glaciers decline, so does the amount of fresh water. Also, uh, the fact that we're losing a lot of ice in the form of glaciers on continental land masses means that that water eventually flows into the ocean. So we're getting a net increase in the amount of water in our oceans, which are causing sea levels to rise. Additionally, in terms of sea level rise, one of the other reasons why we're seeing sea level rise is that when water temperature increases, uh, water volume tends to increase as well as the space between the molecules of water grows. So not only does melting glaciers on the continents increase the amount of water in the oceans, increasing temperature also increases the volume of the water in the oceans as well, and this all leads to sea level rise. As you can see in this graph, right, overall area of ice is starting to decline. Another thing that we briefly talked about in class is the melting permafrost. Uh, Permafrost, as if we remember in the tundra biome, is a permanent layer of frozen soil which has a lot of organic matter from when it was a little bit warmer. This organic matter, when it defrosts, starts to decompose at very high rates. And in aerobic conditions, this can produce excess CO2 into the atmosphere. In anaerobic conditions, it can produce a lot of methane. And in fact, a lot of the areas where the permafrost is established um, are in anaerobic conditions. So it creates sort of a positive feedback loop in that greenhouse gases causes temperatures to increase, which causes the permafrost to thaw out, which causes the release of methane in anaerobic soils into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, which causes the permafrost to melt even faster. We talked a little bit about sea level. As you can see, sea level, there's been a change in the average sea level, only by a few millimeters, but for coastal communities or communities that exist on the mouth of rivers, such as in the Chesapeake Bay area, this can have dramatic consequences. It could lead to additional flooding, of course, but some other consequences include things like a decrease in the amount of marshes in an area. As most estuary ecosystems and saltwater marshes can only exist with a certain amount of water. If the water increases, then the marsh starts to die, and if the rate of increase is too quick and the marsh cannot adapt, then we can lose our vital marsh ecosystem that helps filter out pollutants, helps provide habitat to many endangered species, and provides a very valuable ecosystem service. Also, not to mention the things that we've talked about earlier, the reasons for rising sea levels don't just include the melting polar ice caps. One of the main contributors is the melting of the continental glaciers, which take water that was found on land and puts them into the ocean. So we have a net increase in the amount of water in the oceans And then we also, the thermal expansion that we talked about earlier with the molecules spreading apart further as overall temperature increases, which also causes sea levels to rise. We're having some other things include more frequent heat waves, less frequent cold spells, and one of the major environmental impacts of this is that this allows pest species to expand their range if there's less cold spells. So one example is out in California. There's a bollworm that is highly detrimental to a lot of the vegetable crops that are grown out in California. And with not the prolonged periods of cold that California, interior California sees in the wintertime, these pests can expand their population northward. We've seen that with the armadillo, which used to be, kind of out west in hot areas out west and in Florida. And as overall temperatures have increased, the range of the armadillo has spread north. Where I went to school in Athens, Georgia, when I first started school, it was very rare to see an armadillo, and now they're super, super common. Also, the kind of the global conveyor belt of ocean currents that we talked about way back in chapter 4 can also be affected by a general heating of the Earth's climate. So currents normally work where water right here, sun heats the water in the tropics, that water rises, moves north, and as it moves north, it gets cold and then sinks back down, and we have this sort of this convection current of warm air at the top, cooler air at the bottom, and that's what we see going on here. If we get more polar ice caps melting in certain areas, the addition of fresh water will make it less salty, therefore lighter, and then it won't sink anymore, and so warm water can't move north. So we have water coming from the ice caps that make it, it's an addition of fresh water that makes the Atlantic less salty, which prevents the water from moving north, and that could affect the climates on land, especially in Western Europe. It's good to note some effects of global climate change and global warming in particular on ecosystems, not just abiotic stuff or human stuff, but also non-human biotic components. One of the biggest things that we're starting to see is sort of this asynchronous migration events, where a bird species which migrates based on how long it decides to fly south for the winter based on how long of a photoperiod there is, or basically how long the days are. As the days get longer, they have kind of evolutionarily tuned into that, and they will start to fly south as the days get longer. That also happened to coincide with the hatch out of many insects. So, but insects hatch out due to temperature. So if our winters are ending earlier and getting warmer quicker, then sometimes the bugs and the insects will hatch out weeks before the birds migrate. And this can over time lead to declines in bird populations. And we've seen this with flycatchers throughout North America. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the effects of global warming on ecosystems, on specific animals, and on humans, and on human health, it's time to talk a little bit about the controversy that surrounds greenhouse gases. It's a very politicized event, and it's worth kind of noting that the controversy about it. But it's also worth looking at what we do know as far as the scientific consensus is concerned. Greenhouse gases that cause the planet to warm. We know that for a fact. We know the role of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. Also, the fact that the average temperature across the globe is increasing is not up for dispute and is usually not part of the dispute. But what is up for dispute is how much increase in temperature are we going to see, and at what rate are we going to see an increase in temperature, and whether or not those negative feedback loops that we talked about in class earlier will help mitigate the impacts of global warming, or will the positive feedback loops win out and cause the rate to accelerate even faster. So in 2007, The IPCC, which is the largest kind of concentration of climate scientists from all over the globe, all came together and they assessed the likelihood of events that could occur due to a warming climate. I would definitely make sure to take a look at these for a potential free response question. But you can look, your book has a nice little table right here that you can look at. One last thing to talk about is the Kyoto Protocol. That was an international agreement that seeks to limit the amount of greenhouse gases emitted from developed and developing countries. It seeks to reduce the amount of CO2 in particular by up to 50% by the year 2012. And while it has not attained that goal, a lot of developed countries have made great strides in reducing the amount of CO2. One other thing to note is that the United States has signed with good intentions, but Congress has not ratified the treaty for the Kyoto Protocol. We are the only developed country in the world that has not ratified the Kyoto Protocol. But the U.S. has decided to regulate greenhouse gases through another law, the Clean Air Act, and that just began in 2007. One of the ways that we do this is through emission trading. We tell companies that they have a X amount of CO2 that they can emit into the atmosphere, and they can trade with each other. It's called cap and trade. They can trade with each other pollution credits, and they can gain money for for emitting less CO2 into the atmosphere. If they trade their carbon points with other companies. And then last but not least, carbon sequestration is another technology that we're looking into, where we take CO2 from the source, like from this coal burning power plant right here, and we take it directly and we either dump it beneath the seafloor, we expose it to atmospheric scrubbers, or we use it to pump into greenhouses to plant new to encourage the growth of new trees and other types of plants. Is one other way we've been trying to deal with CO2 emissions. So make sure listen to this. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll review for the test tomorrow.